And so I hear this lady talk about this story of like women in white t-shirts ending a war, and I was like, nah, lady, it didn't go down like that. Only to find out that it actually did. And as every day progressed, we saw fewer and fewer people in all the restaurants. And, you know, a week later, we basically were living in a ghost town.
Since we started a Unreasonable group, I've wanted to work with you. Very, very personal way. I look at you and I see you one of the most values-driven and hell-bent, determined entrepreneurs I've ever met on the planet. And but I want to go. We've gone cursory over your story, right? You know, Liberia women's movement and so on. But I want to go hopefully a lot deeper into that. So I know you're born in Liberia. You came back to the States, and then you went back. Like what propelled you to go back?
Really a conversation with this lady, Neelam Noorani, who was a corporate attorney in San Francisco who'd quit her job to go fight the case against Charles Taylor, the former president of Liberia, for war crimes in Sierra Leone. And we were talking one day, we were introduced to her friend, and she was the person who was like, oh, you're interested in doing like international development work in Liberia. You need to do this work with the women's movement. And I was like, what women's movement? And she was like, oh, you don't know about the women in Liberia? They like ended this war. And I just was like, I don't think so. Mostly because, you know, my dad was very involved in Liberian politics. You know, we had to come to the U.S. in exile, sort of escaping after he had a stint as ambassador, running from the president that he was working for. And I saw for, you know, a decade and a half of my life that war being basically executed in some ways from my living room. He was talking to this guy who was now partnered with this faction, who was then going in after that faction. And all these guys, like my dad was a Stanford PhD. All these guys were PhDs from Harvard and from wherever. And none of them obviously found a solution to this war. All of their solution was more war and more war. And so I hear this lady talk about this story of like women in white t-shirts ending a war. And I was like, nah, lady, it didn't go down like that. Only to find out that it actually did. And that was just really powerful for me. And so my commitment then was to, like, whatever I was doing in San Francisco wasn't that interesting anymore, and I wanted to go do that. Like, that was to me what life was about and what I wanted to dedicate my life to.
So then you quit your job, you left your company. I mean, what were the mechanics of it?
Yeah, I basically was working in finance. I was like at that point, I was like 3.5 years into a job, and I guess they call us a Xennial right now. So in between Gen X and Millennial. So I was like very millennial in that way, where like 3.5 years in a job basically meant that I wasn't really working that hard. Like I was essentially coasting and just had like a really, really nice setup. I kind of miss it actually, quite frankly, much better than being an entrepreneur in so many ways. A little boring, but yeah, you know. So yeah, I was basically, mechanically, it wasn't something I did overnight. It was very, very planned out. It took me months. I took my first trip back to Liberia, and after that first trip, that's when I came back, and I was like, okay, I can give you guys basically a month, and I'm moving there. I'm going to go work with these women. It felt like Good Will Hunting. I got to go see about a girl, except for there was like 100 and some of them. I'm African, so that's not to me. Just kidding. Just kidding.
So you have a job in Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
It's a cushy job. By all indicators, you're successful.
I'm driving a 7 Series BMW that my boss got me for my 25th birthday. I'm I'm chilling. I'm
you're just chilling.
Yeah,
you're coasting.
Yeah.
You hear about this revolution in Liberia led by women with white t-shirts. you go home. I mean, what happened when you went home that caused you to leave all that?
So, first of all, I was really interested in the women's groups that had actually led this peace movement. So I went, almost each one of them, there was about 4 or 5, and almost all of them had a meeting that they'd have on Tuesday nights, essentially. And it's like kind of their community meeting. And so I just worked my way into getting invites into all those meetings. And my first one, I went and I sat down. They had a special seat for me in the front, of course, because I was like the special American guest. Basically, maybe this guy has some money or something. And I just sat there, and they opened the meeting by singing. One person got up there, Yahweh Yeshua Balikai Mamoe, and the whole room stood up and started singing these songs, and I was mesmerized. I was at home, and still in our factory every morning they start with about an hour of song and prayer. It's one of the most powerful experiences. It's very rare that I make it through a morning of prayer with them, both Christian and Muslim women together, without tearing up. I mean, it's that powerful. And like, if you don't believe, you will start to believe in that room. You know what I mean? And so it was this deep sense of, for the first time in my life, having left Liberia at 18 months old, the writer Carlos Fuentes always talks about being Mexican by will and imagination. He was also the son of a diplomat. And I think I was very much Liberian by will and imagination. I had these ideas about Liberia that weren't really real. They were just what I kind of heard. But I identified as a Liberian. And all of a sudden I was there, and I felt home for the first time in my life.
Yeah. And so you're there, you felt home, kind of captivated, but how did that turn into, from finance in Silicon Valley to first fair trade apparel company on the African continent? Like, how did you make that leap?
So I didn't know exactly what business I wanted to start, but I knew I wanted to start a business. I wanted it to be something economically sustainable. And by the way, I have an amazing co-founder in all this, so I'm saying I, but it's very much OB, and with a lot of other folks. And so we started really researching what could happen. And at first, it was a really hot time for microfinance, so we thought that we were kind of descending on Liberia to be microfinanciers, and very quickly realized 2 things. One, the industry was already saturated in Liberia. There were a lot of bigger players already doing microfinance. And number 2, it wasn't really the solution that I felt most comfortable with, because I actually was looking at what could happen in the missing middle and with SMEs. And so I started thinking, what like medium-sized business can you start with a bunch of women who've had no formal training, no education, illiterate? And I was like, garment factories. Obviously, all of them have a sewing program as part of their women's group. It will be so easy, since they already know how to sew, to just convert them to this amazing machinery that I'm going to buy. And that didn't end up being true. But I did it anyways, and I convinced a lot of people that I could do it. And so now it all ended up okay in the end. But in the beginning, it was a real challenge. We recruited women from these women's groups who like had the best moral character. They were sort of nominated by the rest of the group and voted on. But some of these women had only vision in one eye. Some of them had other handicaps. When our trainer came from Italy, he walked in the factory, and the first thing he just looks at me and he says, "There's no way this is going to work." And I was like, why? Yeah. I was like, why? We got the capital, we got the machinery, we got this. And he's like, a factory is supposed to have an average age of maybe like 19, 21, 22. You have 65-year-old women in this factory. Like, what the hell were you thinking? And I was like, I wasn't. I didn't know. But even that like deeply terrible mistake ended up being so great in the end. I just talked about how the women prayed for an hour every morning before they got on the machinery. there's no way we would have built that culture with a bunch of 19-year-old girls out of the gate. Those older women really just set up this beautiful culture, this culture that was so focused and disciplined. And so with our second wave of recruiting and third wave of recruiting, when other people came in, they came into something that they could really believe in. And they came into a really powerful and purposeful workplace. And so even that mistake sort of benefited us in the end.
So let's go a little bit of a roller coaster. Let's go to the high of the first factory, like when it was really booming.
Yeah.
I mean, what did it look like?
First factory was popping. Very hilarious story is that we just Liberia was kind of like Haiti a couple years ago, where like everybody famous would just like come to Liberia. And when they came to Liberia, it's like there's three things they could do. They could meet the president, they could go surf in Robertsport, and like we hear that there's a garment factory here. Like, let's go check that out. So we just had like a revolving door of like random Hollywood is here to help people who would come to Liberia. And one day, who's actually become a really great friend of mine, the reality star Whitney Port, comes with her entire family, and her dad, who's now passed away but became a mentor of mine, basically was so moved by his experience in the factory that he took us back to LA with him, and we ended up with a $20 million agreement from a clothing company called Hager. His friend had recently bought the company, and there was no way, like, we couldn't do $2 million that year. So, like, we kind of, like, signed this agreement, and we're like, we'll figure out, everything later. And then 2 months, not even 2 months, 2 weeks later, a second company, Itochu, the Japanese trading company, sort of heard that we'd pulled this giant agreement with Hager. They'd done $30 million of business with Hager the year before, and they said, yo, we need to be doing this whole Liberia thing too. So they signed a second agreement. So now we had like a bunch of paper that said that we were going to make a buttload of money, and like 60 women in my aunt's basement in Liberia. No possible way to do any of it. But everybody was really, really, really patient about it. Hager actually is a really bizarre thing. They're one of the few clothing companies that still has engineers on staff, and they sent an entire staff of engineers to Liberia to pick a building with us, design it with us, pick the machinery. I mean, we really had like the best of the best in terms of capacity development to get there. So what was really beautiful is like it took us 2.5 years to get everything. We took a building that at that time didn't even have a roof, and we had to rebuild everything. We had to wire it. We had to do everything. Finally, we get everything set up. We've gone through all the quality audits, all the compliance audits, all the machinery is in and installed, all the fabric is in the warehouse. We just like went through this entire process, and we got the first POs issued, about $500,000 of POs for the first month and another $500,000 for the second month, and we were like, dude, this is going to be really, really, really good.
How many women were in the factory then? How many?
So at that point there was 300, and we were working up to 2,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
so
how many years
was
was this in? This was
2013. So we were basically like, three and a half years in.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Then what?
Then one day,
I kind of know what, but yeah.
One day we start reading in the newspapers that there's like a case of Ebola out in the bush in Liberia, and I actually have a farm in Liberia also that is in my family that I manage, and this was all the way out by my farm, which is about a 10-hour drive from Monrovia. So it didn't really it seemed like a bizarre story. Ebola had never been a thing in Liberia. Definitely was not one of our risk factors. I just thought, okay. Yeah, and at the end of the day, Liberian newspapers aren't really that accurate. I guess American newspapers aren't that accurate these days, but Liberian newspapers say all kinds of things, so it's kind of just like, did you just flick me off? No. I was like, damn, it should. Fox News.
It was like
You're like Fox and Friends. Yeah. All right. But yeah, so we just didn't take it that seriously and didn't think it was going to affect us that much. And, there are those times as an entrepreneur where your head is down, You have one thing to get going. Every staff meeting with me started with, we have one job, which is to get the Hager PO shipped, and that's it. Like, as soon as we do that, everything else sort of comes together. And so we just stayed really focused, and as every day progressed, we saw fewer and fewer people in all of the restaurants, and, you know, a week later, we basically were living in a ghost town. And what was really scary was that, obviously, for us, we lived in a very safe place, and there wasn't like a huge risk of contracting Ebola. I don't really believe, but all of our workers, all 300 of these people, lived in these really dense slums, and the idea that just one of them needed to have a child that got sick, or one of them needed to go to a funeral and touch the dead body, which is a custom in Liberia. Like, if any of these things happened and they brought it into the rest of the group, it was pretty much a death sentence for a lot of people. And so we really started talking to the workers at that point, you know, here are the rules. We know we tell you to come to work through everything, but don't do that anymore. If you feel sick, stay home, quarantine yourself, do X, Y, Z. And so we thought we were good. And then on a Monday, I just flown in a new mechanic from Sri Lanka. And I'd flown in, and my girlfriend at the time was living there, who you know very well, a very non-Liberian girl. She's from LA. Not Ebola wasn't really her thing. Yeah. And so, and both of them met on Monday in our factory. And by Thursday, both of them were laying out in a clinic, unable to open their eyes, like just 10 out of 10 headache. And I was like, all right, this is getting really, really real. And the best assurance I could get from a doctor is it's probably not Ebola, but it could be viral meningitis, which is not a fun thing to hear in Liberia in the middle of an Ebola outbreak. So we decided that we needed to leave the country. And we did, and 3 days later, Liberia had declared a state of emergency, and now it was essentially illegal to operate our factory.
Wow. So you had to shut it down.
We had to shut it down. We called the president. I was telling my table earlier at dinner, we called the president's office. We said, listen, as you know, we got these shipments. You guys have been partners with us through this whole thing. What do we got to do to open the factory in 10 days? And they were like, don't open the factory. Like, under any circumstances, do not open your factory. You have no idea what we're dealing with. And so, that was it.
And were you like crushed, devastated, hurt? I mean, how'd you feel?
I mean, there was so much going on at that point. First of all, the sick girlfriend who ended up being totally okay and didn't like die.
Wasn't Ebola?
Yeah, it was not Ebola. So she ended up being okay. I could tell a really funny Rick Ross story right now, but I'm not going to. She ends up being okay. But yeah, I think in terms of my emotional state, at that point I was like in south of France figuring out my next move, but my workers were in West Point, and they had just been 70% of my workforce had just been quarantined and weren't allowed to leave their slum. And I had these Sri Lankan expats on the ground who work on quality and production and all these things for me. So it was mostly like, what am I going to do with my people? I mean, that was really the big scary point. And the good news there is that we didn't have a single case of Ebola within the factory. I think it goes to show the power of strong institutions in contexts like Liberia, post-conflict contexts, where they could get credible information from somebody. We had one of our who was the head of HR at that time, aptly named Angel, actually, would go around and deliver cash and food and medicine to anybody that needed it, so they wouldn't have to leave their home. So we basically just turned from a garment factory to a how do we help 300 families sort of survive a crazy crisis, and it worked.
Yeah. And did you then shut down the business fully in that manifestation?
So we had basically 9 months of limbo. Like, we really had no idea what was going to go on. I would get on board calls and they would ask me, well, what do you think is going to happen? And I'm like, well, CDC doesn't know, State Department doesn't know, Liberian government doesn't know, Chid doesn't know either. So sorry. And so that was it. We were just kind of like waiting for answers, and like I said, sort of trying to provide the support that we needed for the families, and that was my job at that moment.
Yeah. So let's go into like silver lining on this, because I think the whole thing's a roller coaster. I don't know how many phone calls we've shared over the last couple of years, and it's been like this. But I mean, what's the silver lining? What came out of this? I know it's really what you're doing today. But.
So we ended up losing our customers. Those two. We had two really big ones, and then a bunch of other smaller things that we'd always been doing, and so we lost our two big deals, which really was painful. 9 months later, trying to go back, and it was especially tough for all the women. I mean, we went back, and after 9 months, Liberia was Ebola free, and they said, okay, we're ready to work. And I was like, yeah, I got that, but there's no demand. Nobody. Before that, I'd go to a potential customer. I'd say, come to Liberia, come check out what we're doing. They'd say, I'm going to be in Asia next week, but 2 weeks I'll come in, check out the factory. And now I'd say people come to Liberia, and they're like, nah, dude, no thanks. And so it just became really hard to sell what we were doing to people. And we ended up starting our own brand called Uniform as a way to get people back to work, and with the second bonus of helping kids go back to school in Liberia by donating a school uniform. It was a really, really powerful launch of the brand. We actually launched on Kickstarter, so we wouldn't have to go raise any more capital, and then sort of launch it from there. Before too long, we're in Bloomingdale's, and continuing to grow that as a brand and grow our manufacturing business again.
And how many workers, African continent, are you now touching, region?
So over 10,000, which is pretty powerful, and we're right now in the middle of a deal, knock on wood, that would get us to about 100,000 altogether in about 9 countries.
Yeah. So my last question,
yes,
which is, you constantly persevere through these massive valleys, right, and these very real hardships, and we're kind of being lighthearted about it.
Yeah,
but that was brutal. You had to shut down your factory. 300 women who you care about more than anybody couldn't come back into it. You didn't know if you kickstart the business, and we're like a year and a half from that 9-month stretch, and you've launched a new company, positioning to have 100,000 workers. It's absurd what you've done multiple times. Like what gives you the tenacity or the grit or the courage to persevere through this when you don't know what the answer is going to be, but something's pulling you?
I think at the end of the day, it's got to be the women. As much as I talk about how powerful it is to sit with them and to do their morning prayer with them, you get a sense of real responsibility, and I think you get a sense of one thing that I don't necessarily love about Liberia is that people really have faith in their boss and in an institution and in their job, and as long as I have any power in the matter, we're not going to give up on them. And we're going to find some kind of way to make all of this stuff work, because we know what the impact is. We know it can be successful. We've done things that are absolutely crazy. We changed the trade policy between Liberia and the United States in 6 months, in our first 6 months in business. That kind of stuff just doesn't happen. And so, it was kind of like, I don't know if it's good or bad, but I just felt that we were in too deep. And I always knew that I was going to be fine. I could go out and do a billion different things, but what we started was so important, and was so important for Liberia, and so important for conflict-affected countries, because I think what we prove to people in the fact that we're still around 7 years later is that you can invest in those contexts, that it can't just be extractive industries going in, and there's no lack of mining companies, telecom, banking in Liberia, as you'll find in any conflict-affected states, but who's actually providing the kinds of jobs that help to stem conflict. Those businesses, in my point of view, do more to exacerbate conflict, especially if the wealth isn't evenly distributed. So who is going to be in there to actually create businesses like ours, businesses in agriculture and businesses in manufacturing, value addition, businesses in energy? Who's going to be there to prove that those kind of businesses can be successful and be invested in and provide jobs? And so, I refuse to quit on that idea.
Well, Chid, thank you for all your time.
That'd be unreasonable.